great and the highest population. The statistics is very great. It is composed of many sections. Right now, it has more than 15 sections, of which 10 sections have agreed to make one thing, water project for Chakuma. And as I was growing up, we used to fetch water from far away. Whatever we did with water, the water has to be fetched from far away.
This is where we get fresh water from the fountain. This is the main fountain. The water is fresh, cold. You can even drink it, as you can see. That's the process. So I have to fill this calabash with this small container.
From the system of calabash, we moved to the buckets, plastic buckets. From the plastic buckets, we moved to the wheelbarrows, but still far away from the homes, to the springs and everything like that. Now we realized that we were suffering from water issues. Then some men, old men, like also this one, is one of the people who came with the idea that no, there are springs around the mountains. So we need to get water from the mountain down to our homes.
Zvino ndichikoamba ndina madhi mudhini wanga anoenda kuunwa na midhi ya 6 ngori zvova zvitu zvoto ubhajeterwa ndaona uri tituva na vatu vanji vane vakutuso bhajeta chelede yorise hayo madhi mara ndakonowana ine midhi ya 6 rasvikisa madhi ndi hafa yevatu vunji havo vavotomozviona uri hei pulane rajena kayo ingaritusa zvino ndambodhinamba ndavori ndi muengineer uita haya madhi rachimbira richitusana ngamivundu zvazvino kawo muvundu reri kawo lazi angataruchedza zvidhodhombedza zvori apa robvisa hani roisa hani vatu
hapa nonezika mbundu wa rukawu ezviri mbundu wa rukawu ndizvikuzora zvichoma ngamwa wa 2012 ndikusumbedzisa uri rova rina taidzo yamusi husina madhi raona uri ringasiya dova rajiya madhi rina taidzo ya madhi amasipara ndezvi vatu vachikusvika une vakuvanga.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone joining us from all over the world. I think we should get started. My name is Inga Jacobs-Mata, and I'm from the International Water Management Institute in the regional office here in Southern Africa, based in Pretoria. And I will be the moderator for this session. As I said, welcome to everybody, to all the speakers, and especially a very warm welcome to our Honorable Deputy Minister of Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation here in South Africa, Mr. David Mahlobo, who we are really privileged to have join us in this session. Welcome also to all our partners, to the heads of institutions that are joining us, and to everybody else on the call. We have a very big turnout. So far there's about 101 participants, but we are accepting many more. So if you've just joined us, please could you introduce yourself in the chat by typing your name, your institution, your country, as well as your email address. Before we talk about the session for today, just a few house rules. As I said, please introduce yourself. Also make use of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen to ask any questions. And please also use the chat to share any comments, experiences, case studies, share links with the team. We'd really appreciate that level of interaction. Please keep your microphones muted if possible, unless you'd like to speak. And if you do want to speak, please use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen when it's time for the Q&A and for the discussion session. Also, lastly, just note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted at the link below there on our event webpage. But from us here in South Africa, welcome to the world. Welcome to this World War II Week at Home session, where we are now unpacking a very exciting topic for us here, really the changing and the evolving nature of South Africa's water law. As we seek to really operationalize transformative justice in South Africa. We've got a really wonderful team of partners and speakers with us today, starting with Dr. Mark Smith, who is the newly appointed DG of the International Water Management Institute. Really welcome. Mark will give us a global perspective and IWMI's role in what we refer to as hybrid water law. Really the coexistence of statutory water law as well as customary water law and community-based approaches. And then we've got Mr. Desika Naidu, who is the CEO of the Water Research Commission. It's really thanks to the WRC here that we are able to work on this. They are our key funding partner, but also a key research partner in this space. Then we've got Dr. Jennifer Molwantwa. She is representing the Inkomati-Usuthu Catchment Management Agency. She's currently the Executive for Water Resource Management. And we're really excited about our partnership with the IUCMA because they're really leading the charge, if you will, in operationalizing hybrid water law at the catchment level. So we consider them a key implementation partner. And then, of course, as I said before, the Honorable Mr. David Matlobo, who is our Deputy Minister here in South Africa for Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation, to then give us an overview of the evolving nature of water policy, water and sanitation policy in line with our policy review process underway. Equally so, we've got a really good lineup of discussants, and it's really thanks to many of them who guide the project and the work that we're doing, not only in South Africa, but also in Africa. Dr. Barbara van Koppen, who is my colleague at IWMI, an emeritus scientist on poverty, gender, and water. We've also got Ms. Barbara Schreiner, who is currently the Executive Director at the Water Integrity Network. And it's really based on the work of the Barbaras that have sort of laid the foundation for the conceptual framework on which this body of work on hybrid water law is based. They've done significant work, not only in South Africa, but throughout Africa in several of the African countries that we partner with as well. Then we've got Professor Tumai Murumbu, who is part of our reference group for this project, a professor of law at the Wits University here in South Africa. And lastly, Ms. Mary Jean Gabriel, who is the Director for Water Use and Irrigation in the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform. Mary Jean has been working in the agricultural water sector for over 20 years and is also one of our key partners in this space because it really relies on a strong partnership between both of these different departments. So with that, I'm now going to hand it over to Dr. Mark Smith to set the scene for us at the global level and really introduce IWMI's role in this. So thank you. Mark, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Inga. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's just about evening where I am, sitting in Sri Lanka. To everyone, good morning, Mr. Deputy Minister. Good morning and good afternoon, all my friends. It's so fascinating on these Zoom calls when you see the names flashing up of who's participating, and you see you have so many good friends who are joining. So hello to everyone. I wanted to just begin by thanking our partners on behalf of IWMI for co-convening this session. So the Department of Water and Sanitation of South Africa, the Water Research Commission, and the Inkomati-Usuthu Catchment Management Agency. We're really grateful for your collaboration in this session and indeed in this topic more widely. South Africa's water law is held up globally as a really bold example of water law reform and innovation, water law reform and innovation to address inequality and indeed issues of justice. And for those of us who've been fortunate enough to be going to Stockholm over these last many years, it's a topic of discussion very frequently in the meeting rooms at Stockholm Water Week, because it's such an important example to the world of a reform process in water law intended to spur development. So there's so much to learn from the experience that you've had in South Africa. And that this comes at a time, of course, when unfortunately in the world we face growing inequalities, and especially impacting, of course, inevitably in a way, of course, low income areas and rural areas, peri-urban areas. So it is therefore, we do really therefore appreciate the efforts of the co-conveners in bringing the debate that's been taking place about the results of South Africa's water law reform, its future prospects, and the changes that might be needed in the kinds of approaches that are deployed to a global network that's convening this year virtually, but to that network that engages in Stockholm Water Week annually. For IWMI, this topic is important for many reasons, but to try and make it a little bit practical, I wanted to just highlight the example of a very important area of IWMI's work that we carry out in many different parts of Africa on developing and promoting farmer-led irrigation. The purpose, of course, of that kind of development is to bolster livelihoods in rural areas, and as I say, particularly in Africa. And that's great. There's lots of technical development, business models, capacity development, extension around the idea, the concept, the technologies of farmer-led irrigation. But what if the legislative support for such development of water resources is not there in ways that will reduce inequalities? What if the legislative framework in which you're trying to undertake those kinds of innovation actually works against reducing inequalities? What if instead the legal framework means that there's a risk of widening inequities? So it's a crucial question. This question of water law reform is a crucial question for things like farmer-led irrigation, but also the wider issues of water resources and development, and the kinds of interventions that we seek to develop and deploy to reduce poverty. So this session is exploring experiences from South Africa that help to address the questions that revolve around these issues, and doing so in a way that through an approach to water law that has potential to better address the challenges of inequities and indeed objectives of justice. And this is the concept of hybrid water law, as Inga had highlighted. And we will, of course, we'll hear much more about that concept as we go through this session. But it starts with the idea of decolonizing water law. So deconstructing, I'm no lawyer, but just as the way I've understood it, is deconstructing the structural inequities in water law that are a legacy of the colonial governments that were in place historically in much of Africa, and replacing those legal frameworks with a new suite of legal tools that combine that sort of more formalized regulatory, formalized approach to regulatory permits for very high impact water users with other approaches that are more suited to smaller scale and customary water uses. And those are organized in ways that use more accessible legal means, that are more accessible to people that need to benefit from water resources development. So customary water tenure, collective licenses, and different kinds of approaches to exemptions and prioritizations against different of uses against different kinds of criteria. So we look forward very much then in this session to hearing about the concept of hybrid water law and its emergence through the experiences, debates, and lessons that have been taking place in South Africa around South Africa's water law and its experiences with that, and discussing those lessons learned, and then considering how do we merge innovation in water law with innovation that drives things like farmer-led irrigation, so that we can ultimately all collectively become, of course, therefore more successful in our efforts to spur innovation that helps, that does a better job of delivering, does a better job of reducing inequities and achieving poverty alleviation. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Inga, and I'll wish everyone a good session, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Mark. And it really makes me proudly South African when I hear you say, you know, that South Africa's water law has really, and particularly our National Water Act, has been quite pioneering. It's been quite innovative in including very unique legal tools, free basic water, the ecological reserve, but also, you know, more than 20 years on now, we look at how can we build and how can we evolve to the times, and that's where we are right now, looking at those, as you say, decolonizing, deconstructing structural inequalities, particularly the permit system is one of those aspects that we look quite closely at, and how do we transform, you know, or what should be transformed within the existing law, and what is strong that needn't be. So now I'm going to hand it over to Desika Naidu from the WRC to give us that national R&D perspective for this work. So Desika, over to you. Thank you.
Inga, thank you very much. Firstly, congratulations, Mark, on your new posting, and we look forward to even more partnership in the years to come. And I also want to say that it's fairly gratifying to note how many folk on this panel and on this agenda have a fairly strong WRC connection. It warms the heart a little bit. Colleagues, I'm going to share a presentation with you. And it's only a couple of slides, so don't be too alarmed, to walk through this journey. The first thing that I want to emphasize is that, yes, we are looking at legal regimes for transformative justice, and yes, we are using South Africa as a case study, but as Mark has pointed out, that in the many years, in many fora, including that of Stockholm World Water Week, this is a matter of interest in most parts of the world. In fact, there are very few national regimes that are completely comfortable with the way that they're currently doing things. So a quick reminder that we are in a very water-stressed world. And I think that we all are hyper aware of this. We're hyper aware of the fact that the scenarios associated with the climate crisis are pushing it in a more difficult direction. We are quite clear that the COVID pandemic has highlighted the matters for us in a way that was graphic for the people who have been blind to it or for a while have been able to duck away from it. Well, it's inescapable as we sit right now, and all of the scenarios that we are looking at are organizing for us to see possibly an even more difficult future. Now, alongside all of this, we have this as a huge effort and a huge global project to organize for us around Sustainable Development Goal number 6, that associated with water and sanitation and related services, to have a decade of action organizing for us between now and 2030 to get much, much closer to that target, or possibly even have that universal access to safe water and dignified sanitation by 2030. It's important to note that there are 5 pillars organizing itself around this global acceleration framework. There's finance, there's data and information, there's innovation, there's capacity and capability, and that big pillar around governance, because governance continues to be one of the challenges that we have to engage, and we have to engage head on. But colleagues, I am aware that for many people that are in this meeting, and many more people outside, this is probably the first northern spring that you're not in Stockholm. So I thought I could take through some of my thoughts as a journey through the Stockholm Water Prize laureates to illustrate the points that I want to make and give you just a wee bit of nostalgia. Maybe next year you will be in Stockholm, maybe it'll be the year after that, but at least you would have gone through this journey. So I begin with this person, and this is someone that is famous to all of you and very well known, and that's Professor Kader Asmal. And Professor Kader Asmal in 2002 was the Stockholm Water Prize laureate and was on the back of South Africa producing this very water law that both Inga and Mark have already referred to, and I think it will come up many times in the discussion. It organized for the world a template. This was its attractor. A template of possibility, because the idea of water law is a complicated concept, primarily because we've been fighting over it from a legal perspective for at least 100,000 years. We've been fighting over water for as long as human beings have been on this planet. So organizing the concept of a national legal regime in the first place to govern water law was in itself a novelty. But to organize for that, to move this decolonization project, to move from the apartheid internal colonization project to a democratic society project where governance worked on the principle of subsidiarity and complete participation, was incredibly novel. But we rapidly learned that the template itself couldn't organize for us to get to where we needed to go. And then I want to then refer to the next laureate in this small journey, and that's John Briscoe. John Briscoe didn't dabble too much in the legal regimes or even in the governance regime, but he worked very hard around organizing for how you implement the objectives and the goals of those regimes in very practical ways around a series of case studies around the world, including my own country, but very global, but with a nationalistic context around how you organize for toolboxes to make this actually work. And then we went a little bit further, a little bit later on, and the third laureate that I want to cite is Rajendra Singh. Rajendra Singh put a whole new dimension into this discussion, and one I think that is very relevant for what we're talking about today. Rajendra Singh himself started his life off as a traditional doctor, was highly invested in customary law and customary traditions, and that's what he brought into the work that he did, and eventually earned the title of Waterman of India, and of course, eventually, a Stockholm Water Prize laureate, and started to talk about, in a very public context, how you can organize to take the formal legal regimes that were available, coming from the likes of Kader, and people will claim, and quite rightly so, that there are many toolboxes that eventually led to this that were already being worked on in various parts of the world for a very long time. This is absolutely true, that the South African water law organized to harmonize that into a single template. And this maybe is our biggest contribution. But Rajendra brought into this the aspect of what actually works inside systems and how you can blend that together with the formalization of law to organize for at least a development paradigm around how we get access to water, the management of the resource, and most importantly, how we organize for a beneficiation regime around this so that you maximize not only the access, but the access to the benefits of water and indeed of sanitation as something related. Then the fourth laureate that I want to talk to is last year's laureate, and that's Jackie King. Jackie King, who has been labeled ever since that ceremony last year as the mother of environmental river flows, brought in that vital aspect into this discussion, the aspect of environmental justice. And when we're engaging the concept of what an ideal legal regime should be, and its hybridization with various aspects that organize for it to have the maximum possibility of both implementation and sustainability, we have to do it in the context that we are indeed looking at a human rights approach, but we're also looking at environmental justice as a very key part of this. Not only for the usual reasons, but for the more important reason of a sustained sustainability and increased water security inside the system, which is absolutely crucial. So if we bring this all down to a couple of pictures, we're talking about this. We're talking about the center pillar in this particular thesis of being the constitutional regime. In the case of South Africa, and this has been replicated in many parts of the world since, on the African continent and beyond, organizing for a human rights-based approach around how you organize a constitutional regime embedded with the Bill of Rights as it pertains to various basic needs, but water and sanitation being one primacy to this community of practice, but strongly informed, but not only the human rights-based approach, but the environmental justice approach alongside that. And then in addition to that, to say that there are certain things that make systems work in various parts of the world. And they have been working for millennia. And many of those things are embedded in traditional systems. Some of those are embedded in customary law. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that going into the realm of nostalgia around this is going to be very difficult. In fact, in the video that Inga played at the beginning, which was of Ma Flo, who is one of our champions around multi-use systems, she made this point repeatedly in several fora where we had this discussion, that parts of customary law really organize for us to blend into the harmony of how things work in communities on the one hand, while the constitutional regime manages to get all of those things that were in fact inhibitors around the rights-based regimen in many of those communities. So it is a case of pulling out what is the good, dealing with what is the less good, and organizing for the regime to work in a way that gets us to this point, that the harmonization of these three components must organize for us to take the transformational imperative further. So colleagues, this is how we're thinking about things from a national perspective. From an R&D perspective, knowledge must drive this regimen. So we are examining and analyzing the possibilities that exist of various regimes and how we can harmonize that into a workable formula, not only for one place as a centralized template, but with the right kind of harmonization and customization for the different places in which it needs to operate, because it strongly depends on the stakeholder base that exists in different parts and what kind of priorities there are around the water uses. But our view is that if we adopt this transformational approach, organizing to have sufficient flexibility and an agility to adapt to conditions as they change, we will probably be on the right path towards securing that pillar that will organize for us to realize the benefits of a global acceleration framework. So with those few words, I will stop there, and there's a lot more information, of course, available on our website. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much for that, Desikan, and thank you also for raising the, just picking up on two things that you mentioned. First of all, the global trends in environmental justice, and it's quite interesting that this session today is sandwiched in between a session that happened yesterday with the FAO, the Environmental Law Institute, that looked specifically at water tenure approaches for securing rights and advancing climate resilience. picking up on very much the same issues. And Stephen Hodgson was talking about, you know, the water tenure assessment guide that is being developed at the global level, which was really interesting. At the same time, tomorrow's session with one of our local institutions, the University of the Western Cape Plus, looking at, you know, legal pluralism and perhaps the, you know, are we not romanticizing customary water law? And so it's an interesting debate, you know, the need to achieve environmental and transformative justice and not romanticizing this too much. I know my colleagues in government from DWS as well as Department of Agriculture would always say, Inga, you know, this is easier said than done. You're an academic in the research world, you know, it's much more difficult to translate this into practice. Thank you very much for that, Des. And so now somebody that really works at that coalface, at the catchment level, where this is really, you know, where the rubber hits the road, is our colleague, Dr. Jennifer Mulwantwa, who is the Executive for Water Resources Management at the Inkomati-Usuthu Catchment Management Agency, one of our key partners, as I said before. The Inkomati-Usuthu is really, in many respects, a model catchment. Because they have so many of these projects underway. But Jennifer, from your side, please share with us a little bit about, you know, what are the realities on the ground in actually, you know, translating hybrid water law into practice. Thanks, Jen.
Hello and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. I am really honored to be part of this, representing the Inkomati-Usuthu Catchment Management Agency. And I would like to also greet the Deputy Minister, the Honorable Deputy Minister. And yes, this again, this sounds like an old WRC management meeting or something like that, because we've all been there. But I think key to that, it's the fact that research plays a very key role in answering questions that we have experienced and we're still trying to find solutions, or we still don't know and we want to prepare ourselves so that in future, when the future happens, we are ready for it. Just to give a brief overview of what the IUCMA is about, I would like to just quickly share these 4 slides before I get into the meat of it. Right. So the Inkomati-Usuthu Catchment Management Agency is located, for those that are far elsewhere in the world and who do not know, we are based in South Africa. We are based in the northeastern part of South Africa. We border the countries of Swaziland and Mozambique. And as such, we are the transboundary water management area. We are also we form part of what we call the Inkomati Basin, which is the basin that includes both the Republic of Mozambique and the Kingdom of Eswatini, which is operated under the Interim Inko-Maputo Agreement. For short, we say IMA. And the background that we must take into consideration when we talk about hybrid water and when we talk about really the challenge of making sure that everybody has equitable access to water, must take into consideration the fact that we are a stressed catchment. We definitely have got a higher demand than what we can supply. And we have got long rivers, little storage, particularly in the crocodile. We have to comply with the international obligations, ecological flows, and we are striving for equitable access to the water resources. The total water demand and the current licensing, if you can look at the 2 pie charts on the right, you will see that outside the available water, we have got agriculture, which is the biggest user of water. We have the ecological reserve, which, and when you look at this, you realize that the picture should actually look the other way around, where you have got your reserve and everything else then can follow after that. We've got afforestation, strategic use, where we have got transfers out of our catchments into other catchments. We have got cross-border water requirements as well as domestic water requirements. And the presentation slides before were focusing mainly on the surface water. And as a result, we need to step out of our common knowledge of water use relating to rivers and just flowing water. And we have looked at groundwater. In terms of groundwater, we have a surplus of groundwater. Based on historical data, we are currently doing a project to update that data and have a better picture of what is the case. And we also need to enable and change the kind of perception that is regarded with relation to groundwater. Groundwater is a source of water, and surface water, springs, streams, and other are all part of the resource. And when we want to have a strategy that will be able to ensure that we have got equitable access, we should not be looking at ground and surface water as different water resources, but looking at it as a continuum. We have got a number of stakeholders in our water resource management, including from government, our mother department, the minister and deputy minister, the department. We have got water users are represented in the form of catchment management forums, where we try to find key water users as well as ordinary water users, subsistence water users, to put them in the different forums where they can be able to discuss challenges of water resource related. Stakeholders are keeping themselves accountable to one another in terms of what they are doing, pollution, availability over abstraction, and all of that. We also have got water user institutions, management institutions. Currently, we have got 21 irrigation boards, and we have got only 2 water user associations. And I think we must, I'll focus my talk on more of the water management institutions. We also have got government institutions, the different departments, COCTA, which also encompasses the House of Traditional Leadership, and House of Traditional Leadership plays an important role in terms of when we're looking at hybrid water law. We also have got your Department of Rural Development, Land, Agriculture, Environmental Affairs, and others. But we also have got other key stakeholders, and as well as our international counterparts. Now, my discussion around this says, on the background that we've got more demand compared to what we can supply, and this is a historical making, what then becomes the role of the IUCMA in terms of ensuring that there is equitable access? The National Water Act is very clear, and it directs us toward equitable water access to all, for all. However, the challenge is that to unravel what has been and to make what should be, as is envisaged by the Act, it's very much difficult. It has been over 10 years now that the IUCMA is in operation, but all of this we have not yet achieved. And I think, Inga, you were correct when you said, what are the challenges, what is happening on the ground? Therefore, at this current moment, the tolerance of the people and the patience of the people is really at its wits. People want water, not only for water for drinking purpose, but water for poverty eradication. Your basic subsistence farmer is looking to collect water, to have water in their yard, so that they can be able to water their plants, and that will be able to provide food on the table. And how then has this happened? We have realized that because a bulk of our water is locked within the irrigation board system, which also on its own, all those 21 irrigation boards, they do not cover the entire water management area. They were established to cater for smaller groups of people that own the land, and therefore they are accountable to that. Now, the process that we are undertaking, which is a very critical process, and which this project feeds into, is the transformation of the water management institutions. The spirit of the Act has got at its center equitable access and the establishment of water user associations. It's one such vehicle which has been way too long, and it is too late now, but we are in the process of transforming and implementing. The idea of the water user associations will make sure that all of the land within the length and breadth of the water management area is covered. So there is no one that will fall outside the confines of the water user association, which means within a water user association, you'll have a municipality, you'll have agriculture, you may have mining, you may have forestry, you have other uses such as cross-border and strategic use. And when you have a water user association established, it means that all needs are taken care of. What have we done currently? We have tested the water allocation plan principles, where we took one of our two sub-catchments, the White River.
You have 1 minute?
Yes, the White River as well as the Cup. And what we realized is that there's still pushback in terms of how people view sharing water. And therefore, we believe that hybrid water is going to enable us to support these water users on the ground. I support the view that there needs to be a lot of funding that is put on in this regard, particularly looking at infrastructure for boreholes, water tankers, and tanks linked to groundwater, so that there is access of water for the ordinary people that look at us as a water management institution to provide both for their agricultural needs, subsistence farming, as well as for emerging farmers. I will pause there. Thanks, Inga.
Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. Really insightful, and something that stuck with me, you know, is people want water and they want it for multiple uses, which is something I think that Barbara van Koppen can also speak to in the discussion. Really important, and particularly we're talking about smallholder farmers, and what are these legal tools like water use licenses, permits that either help or hinder their access to water. So that's something I hope we can discuss in the discussion section at the end of this. But now, without any further ado, I'd really like to introduce our final speaker, the Honorable Deputy Minister here in South Africa for Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation, Mr. David Matlobo, who will really give us an outline and overview of South Africa's evolving water landscape, as well as, you know, the importance of achieving transformative justice through water. So thank you, DM. It's now over to you.
Thank you very much, Doc, Comrade Inga, and all other colleagues that are here, especially our colleagues from the Water Research Commission and the Institute for Water Management, and all our partners that are here, including your esteemed panel that we have gathered. Firstly, let's just thank you on behalf of His Excellency, our President, President Ramaphosa, that you have invited us to participate and share some few thoughts. And we are very pleased that you are keeping safe, because we are meeting at a time of the severe acute respiratory syndrome, COVID type 2 of a virus, which is COVID-19. And we know that many people have lost their lives, and I will join others that have said, let's bow our heads and convey our sincere condolences to all those families, for those that have been able to succumb to the battle against COVID-19. Equally so, we will also want to convey our words of encouragement and support and solidarity for many of our people that are currently affected by COVID-19, and we will want them to be in a position to recover very fast so that we don't have problems. At the very same time, we also want to salute those frontline staff that have passed on, especially in the water and sanitation sector, that have given us the ability to ensure that there is running water and sanitation during this difficult period. Well, in terms of the topic that we have chosen, it's very important to indicate that because of the history for where South Africa comes from, in a difficult past. In 1994, we were to actually do certain fundamental issues. One of the issues that we did was to transform on how water has been managed in South Africa, including other services. In the main, were to include this issue of water as a human right. When you look at our constitution in terms of Chapter 2, we have a right to environment, that we need to ensure that the environment where we live in is not harmful. Therefore, it comes in very handy in terms of our national legislation. Secondly, we also made it a point that access to basic services like water and sanitation are included as a right, same level as a right to life, the right to other issues that are there in our own constitution. Immediately after that, our predecessors, Comrade Kada Asmal and those that were there, including Comrade Barbara Schreiner, who was one of your panelists, they worked on a water policy that was a precursor to the National Water Act, which was concluded in 1998 and assented into law by His Excellency, our former President Nelson Mandela. Equally, there was also the Water Services Act that was done in 1997. One of the things that is very transformational about the National Water Act, it looked at the principle of equity and sustainability. It had to take into consideration in its own preamble that we envision a situation of sustainable use of water resources for the benefit of all South Africans. We are coming from a period where water was not belonging to all South Africans. There were discriminatory laws and practices that prevented a number of our own citizens, in the majority Black South Africans, that they had no access to water for use, but also for issues of beneficial use. One of the things that this law had to recognize is that we are a water scarce country, and the water resources, including infrastructure and distribution network, they were unevenly distributed. In the main, if you look at South Africa's experience, there was a time when the government of a time, they chose that because of apartheid reasons, but also because they had the discovery of mineral wealth, they had to be able to transfer water from various basins and catchments to only one important area, which is at the time was Transvaal, Johannesburg, because there was a discovery of gold. That's why we have one of the biggest integrated schemes called Integrated Vaal Scheme that has about more than 14 schemes that are just feeding in, including water that come from another countries like Lesotho, that comes into one particular area. What then it meant that all the water sources, the infrastructure was developed in the bigger cities, whether it is Johannesburg, whether it's Cape Town, whether it's Durban, infrastructure so well developed. Then we inherited a situation where we said in our own laws, water must start to benefit all South Africans. In other words, you have the biggest backlog where in certain communities, there was no infrastructure at all, or in certain communities, there was not even a water source that has been developed, where to be able to deal with those particular issues. At the very same time, we also had the existing infrastructure where you had the water systems, whether it's your dams and canals of hundreds and hundreds of kilometers that were going through certain provinces, going through certain communities, and they were all going to the economic hubs or the economic centers of our land. And those communities were not benefiting. That's why one of the most important issues that this government had to do was to be able that the existing infrastructure will be opened up. We should be able to ensure that water is provided to all South Africans, even in our own dams. They will be used by other people of minorities, where they will use them for recreation, economic activities. And you had many of the single purpose dams that we have just converted into a multi-purpose dams. This is where we're actually coming from in terms of the transformation. Our history indicates that most South Africans, more than 90% South African today, they have an access to basic services, which is water and sanitation. We know that the population has grown, there's climate change, there is a deterioration how we manage assets. One other point that we need to be able to indicate about our own transformation of the water system. There was an issue about entitlements of water use, the issues of the legal principles. In the old Water Act of our country in 1955, that act that we repealed, there was always a close connection between access to land and access to water rights. Because in the main, you know that the majority of our land was taken forcefully, and ultimately it belonged to only few South Africans who happened to be white. And therefore, we had to deal with the issues of riparian rights. And these riparian rights were then be in a position that we repeal them, but we still have a problem, which is one of the issues that when we do the reform, we have to be able to deal with the question that there is a certain section in our own laws, which is Section 38 of the National Water Act, that talks about access to certain rights, which is existing lawful use. That has been one of the problems that has been affecting the issues of transformation. But in the main, we have never been able to test the legislation because there have been challenges in as much as our law is well-renowned, well-respected, about the capacity of the state, especially the own Department of Water and Sanitation and other entities, that over time our capacity has deteriorated and we're brain drained. Because one of the important issues was to deal with the question of registration of all water users. We're supposed to verify them and validate the quantum that they're using so that we can use the instrument, because there's a transformation instrument in our own laws, which is the licensing. The licensing regime was going to be able to assist us to deal with issues of compulsory licensing. And we have not been doing well. And I know that Dezekin and the team, they're dealing with that particular important issue. One of the issues that is also very important, that is transformational in our own legislation, there is a provision for general authorization, which does not require a license. If most communities, like in rural communities, where there's no access to infrastructure, there's a springs that are there, there's a use of groundwater, and is not used for higher scale use or economic use. We then said that those can be generally authorized in terms of the schedule that you find in the National Water Act. And it was also meant to assist us to deal with the issues of skewed allocation. There was a program called Water Allocation Reform that seeks to address the inequities around issues of gender representation, racial representation, including access. Unfortunately, that particular program has not been able to go as far as we have wanted, because it could have succeeded if we had done compulsory licensing after validation and verification of our processes are. But I'm pleased that in terms of the reform process, we are really looking at the question of the National Water Act and the Water Services Act. We are now at a stage that if you look at the National Water Resource Strategy, whether the first version or second version or the current version we're working in, including the National Water and Sanitation Master Plan, those issues are still included in our own legislation. The other matter that I thought before we conclude is the role of government, that the central government has an important role as a custodian of water resources for our people, to ensure equitable allocation and for the benefit of all. That's why you have an element that government had to ensure distribution of water, but more importantly, remember, we share our water costs with our neighboring state. Therefore, the issues of international obligation and international treaties is part of one of the most transformation instruments, because if we don't cooperate, both in the region and elsewhere in the world where we share water causes, there is a potential for conflict. There can be wars. Even the current situation that is currently happening in the Nile River with Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt is a very important example that if we don't cooperate, someone is always living downstream. I will not make the example about other issues that are happening internationally. The other matter that is very important in our own legislation, like the issues of constitution, is the issue of the reserve. The reserve is the most important transformation element in that law because it caters for human needs, including the ecological reserve and international obligation. This is a best practice that we've been using over time, and we can be able to say we've made strides in that particular area. One issue that we used to be transformational issue that we had to handle well, which is technical, is the protection of the water resource in terms of quality. Because of urbanization, climate change, issues of capacity, loss of engineers and skilled personnel, there is a deterioration of water quality in our own country, and it's a matter that we're looking for. Well, the last point is integrated water resource management in terms of governance. I'm happy that Comrade Jennifer from Inkomati-Usuthu CMH is here. One of the issues is about public participation. Water is a societal issue. Government alone can't make decisions on these issues. Communities must be involved. That's why in a catchment management, which is a management of water in a locality, we have government, we have business that is there, and all other users, including the institution of traditional leaders and other institutions that are there. And we have done well. We have two that are working, and we're working very fast now to try to expedite the process because it's nearly 10 years behind schedule. We need to roll out the other remaining 7 CMAs so that the CMAs, they can develop their own catchment management strategies and local policies where the hybrid model of water use, we should be able to look at. Therefore, the issues also that were transformational in our own case is free basic services. And we are doing well in as much as there's a consumption that is high, the behavior and attitude of people must be changed so that we can conserve the little water that we have. Challenges that we have to note, issues of capacity, knowledge and skills management remain an important issue. If our transformation imperatives are going to work, knowledge and skills is the way to go. That's why we must thank Deseken for the research that they've made. Other partners that we need to be able to work closely is finance institutions for water resource to be developed, to be managed, and also to be preserved for the next generation. Issues of financing, very important. Governance cannot be overstated. Those institutional arrangement, issues of corruption, issues of unethical conduct are some of those particular issues. And technological advancement can be able to help us, is a transformation tool that is in our hands, including the issues of research and development. With those words, Comrade Dr. Ingham, I want to wish you all the best with the panel. And this is an important work that you are doing. Let's be able to put the issues of water and the transformation of our policies, our institutions, including our own methodologies at the apex priority, because water is the only weapon in our hands to fight the pandemic. Water is one of the most important weapons to ensure that our socio-economic goals are being realized at this particular point. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. And there was so much in what you said, so many golden nuggets. But one thing that I took from it was, of course, water is a human right at the end of the day. But this access to land and access to water debate, you know, and how that, we talk about customary land tenure, we also talk about customary water tenure, and Barbara van Koppen, I'd like you to also bring this out a little bit in the discussion, because we were chatting just about this yesterday, about what is the difference, you know, between customary land tenure, customary water tenure, and what are the implications for people on the ground, smallholder farmers at the end of the day. Thank you so much, DM. There's a lot of really good comments and questions coming from the floor. So I want to give an opportunity to the speakers now to respond to some of those. Just to summarize, for instance, There was one point around, you know, the institutional, weak institutions in the irrigation space. It was a question directed at IMI in terms of IMI's role in strengthening institutional innovation in irrigated agriculture in African countries. I will speak to that because unfortunately our DG had to drop off the call. But there are also others. Len Abrams, really good question from you around, and for those who don't know, Len Abrams was one of the people really instrumental in drafting the National Water Act, and he shares an experience about what Kader Asmal said to that drafting team, that what should keep them up at night was not the immediate issues of the day, but what would become clear, or the consequences of which would only become clear in 20 years from then. So the question was, what should they have been losing sleep about back then, which has now become clear. I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in on that. Washington Yabezi, hi Washington, he's also shared around how we can achieve transformation towards equity when conditions for participation of the marginalized and relevant processes are consistently inhibited and undermined. It comes back also to Jeffrey's comment in the chat around how do we engage more with smallholder farmers in the CMA processes. I see Desikan, you want to weigh in, so I'll give Desikan a chance. And Jennifer, there was also a question directed at you. Perhaps you'd also want to quickly respond to that. So Desikan, over to you.
Thank you, Inga. I think that I have the backup of my boss on the call. I can be a little bit brave with the Deputy Minister around. Len Abrams' question, greetings Len, is a really critical one. And unfortunately, the answers are easy. The thing that is keeping a lot of us awake is, number one, the implications of non-implementation, the implications of the delayed promise, the implications of putting out a close to perfect legal regime that hasn't found the same kind of momentum in changing the lives of the people on the ground because of the lack of implementation in many of those areas. So that may be the biggest thing of all. The thing that comes in as a close second is the incredible sophistication and capacity and capability associated with those people who want to maintain the status quo. You know, when the law was out, and I was a much younger person then, hanging around the coattails of the likes of Len and Barbara and the gang, the ideal promise was that people would see the logic of where we were going to and clearly see that there was a multi-beneficiary status associated with this, and people would jump onto that bandwagon. Well, the reality has kicked in, that the status quo is worth a lot to some folk, and they will protect it at all costs. And the third thing that, if that insomnia is not enough, is the big issue of water quality. Water quality in its various areas of acceleration, not the least being associated with many more of us in a very water-intensive environment that organizes for increased water quality problems, but over and above that, the emerging pollutants. So, Len, there's not much room for sleep nowadays. We need you back.
Thanks for that. I want to quickly go to Jennifer, because there was one or two questions for her. Jennifer, there was a question around how the current water laws regarding river water distribution is helpful in managing the supply and demand gaps. And I know IUCMA have done quite a bit in implementing a water audit to reconcile, you know, registered water use with actual water use. Maybe you can say a little bit more about that. There was also another point, but maybe just to come off Desikan's point, I think Ashwin Seetal has raised a similar issue around, you know, the implementation and specifically the let me just go to it. the fact that we cannot legislate mindset and prejudice change. I like that. Thanks for that, Ash. Jennifer, would you like to weigh in at this moment?
Yes, thank you, Inga. I think starting with what Ash asked, I've said education and awareness is a must, Inga, not only to educate the marginalized about their rights, and empowering them in terms of what is going to be discussed at forums and what is their view, and explaining it into their own language and making sure that when they come into those situations, they can also be able to participate, but also to educate those that have. It has become very much important, and I think how we have done strategic adaptive management, we have the key stakeholders, we discuss the issue of the drought, for example, how much water we have, and we self-imposed restrictions. Now, this has become a reality for the last five years, where those that have the water, including the irrigation boards, have realized that the water that they have on paper is actually not water that is there in the system. And as a result, the process of verification and validation, updating our hydrology, those are the things that we're using to start indicating that this is the reality of the water situation. It has to be shared, but more importantly also, we are using research with the Water Research Commission, Inga, in a project where we are testing water use efficiency. Because when we are saying they are using more, they say, how can you prove it? Now we are doing a project with the Water Research Commission in that regard, and making sure that they understand that the water is not overly subscribed. It is not there, and we have to sustainably manage it and make sure that everybody gets the water. There was also a question that asked about the river flows and how we make sure that the laws must be changed. Look, Inga, we have the institutional democracy and the consultative nature of how we do work in the water space and in everything that we do. It's very much important. But you know, sometimes we consult so much that we don't get to the answers. And the CMA, once it has its full powers and functions as anticipated in the Act, Inga, will be able to, together with the water users, come up with directives. Hence, the water user associations is a neutral and a better vehicle, because then you'll sit in the room and you will try to get to a consensus, but when there's no consensus, people must vote and we go with that. And therefore, that ability to regulate and to issue regulations will assist us in ensuring that together we are managing the water resources together with our water users. And do we need to change the water law? I think not so much change it drastically. We need to implement, as Desigan has said. Public participation is at the center of what we are doing. Traditional leaders are at the center of who we're working with, because they have got the support and the understanding of the people, and therefore they become our key partners in ensuring that we are managing water in a sustainable manner. Thank you, Inga.
Thanks very much, Jen. And, you know, just in terms, I like that comment that you know, death by participation, I suppose. But it's also something that Toko raises in the chat. Hi, Toko, around, you know, the fact that we have processes in place, community forums at the community level to encourage participation. And certainly this is also IMI's main, you know, role in building institutional strength, or, you know, strengthening institutional capacity at the local level, is to work at that community level. The video that we showed in the beginning was some of the projects that we're working on in what we call supported self-supply, where we work with the communities as funders, as contractors of their own community-based infrastructural development. So if people are interested in that, I can also share with you a little bit. I think it was Depisa, I think it is, who raised that question about institutional strengthening, and we would be delighted to share a little bit more with you on that. So thank you to the speakers, and now I'm going to hand it over to the discussants. So discussants, if you can please enable your cameras. And I'm also going to bring my colleague, Patience Mukuyu, who's going to help me moderate, just so that we can include as many of the questions into this discussion as possible. So I've introduced the group in the beginning, but let's go around and Barbara Schreiner, we start with you. You've been involved for so many years, the development of the Act, in the reviews, and now also not necessarily as an outsider, but certainly as an advisor, you know, advising on this project, but also so many others. What are your thoughts on the current trajectory of water reform, water policy reform in South Africa, and how can we better enable the process of transformative justice in South Africa? Barbara, over to you.
Thanks, Inge. Can you all hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Deputy Minister, colleagues. It's a real pleasure to be here, joining you from Berlin, but talking about something that is very dear to my heart. And I know I don't have much time. There's a million things I would like to say, including thanks for making me feel very old by going through the history of the water law process. I think the reality is, you know, that in South Africa we have an enormously powerful piece of legislation that we have not fully utilized. And part of the question goes to, how does one want to utilize it? Is it being utilized in order to try and control small water users, or is it being utilized in order to try and enable the water use of small users? The Deputy Minister referred to general authorizations. Are they being used as an enabling tool or a controlling tool? And that takes me to the National Water Resources Strategy, which actually sets out as the third priority in the country in terms of water use for poverty eradication and the livelihoods of the poor. And if we're taking that seriously, then in fact we have a number of tools. The other thing that I haven't heard in the discussion is enough about the legal status of customary law in South Africa. I'm not a lawyer either, but there have been various rulings by the Constitutional Court that have actually validated the status of customary law in relation to communities that are actually functioning under customary law. I have not seen anybody explore what that means in terms of water. I'm quite sure that it actually gives a status to customary law in water that has not been recognized. I just wanted to pick up as well on the notion of not romanticizing customary law and say, yeah, don't romanticize customary law, but please can we not romanticize statutory law either? We talk about, and the world talks about South Africa's legislation as being world-class, etc., etc. But if you're not implementing it and you're not achieving the objectives that the law was set out to achieve, then actually it's not a gold standard piece of legislation, because if we can't implement it and we can't keep saying to ourselves, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the capacity. We have to find ways of actually implementing the spirit of the law. And part of that for me is taking the best of customary law, the best of the statutory law, the most imaginative minds in the country, and saying, how do we actually bring all of those together to make sure that we can actually transform access to water for poor and marginalized communities in particular. I can carry on. I can carry on if you want me to, Inge. But
thank you. We'll come back to you, because I think you've really raised some key issues, and you know, pulling from what you've said, and I want to go to Prof. Marumbo now, from a legal background, you know, to speak to some of what you said around, you know, do we have precedent to legalize customary law in other sectors? I know you've mentioned it in the fisheries space, for example, in some earlier discussions. Please, could you share some thoughts around, you know, what role does customary law play in enabling transformation for water access? Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Over to you. Oh, Prof, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you, Inga, and thank you to the presenters, the Honorable Deputy Minister, and to the over 120 participants who are listening in and typing very useful comments on the chat line there. It's just that we have a few minutes or hours to discuss this very important topic. It would require a whole week symposium or colloquium to really unpack the issues that require attention in order to really make the water legal framework transformative. So because of the limited time, I'm just going to highlight what I think are the critical issues that need attention. Obviously, we can talk for the whole day about the nitty-gritties. But I think from the presentations and from the questions so far, there's one thing that I want to emphasize from a legal perspective. A good law that does not deliver on its objectives in terms of practical change in livelihoods is not useful. And as a lawyer, it's very frustrating because I've been part of making very many good laws. Right now, I also sit on the Water Tribunal for South Africa as an additional member, but I'm not speaking in that capacity. But I've seen so many things there. I've read through tons and tons of files, which makes me doubt on the capacity and the potential of the national water legislation in South Africa to deliver on the objectives in Section 2 to transform the water sector. As it is currently framed, the legal framework is very nice. That's why it has got this international reputation, just like the Constitution. It's got an international reputation. When you come to the ground, when you watch on the television, on those pictures of women struggling to get water during COVID, during the pandemic, and when you know, like me, of how many people have how many farms with how many tons of water that they're entitled to and they're not using, some of them, and they've this shield of existing lawful water uses that they are using, and they have this shield of human rights, administrative law, property law rights, that is their armory of resisting change, then we will not be able to achieve the objectives of the National Water Act or transformative water legislation. So that's the first thing that I wanted to highlight. And I want to acknowledge that the Honorable Deputy Minister did point out the issues of capacity and the issues that have sort of detracted from effective implementation of the National Water Act. It is not by accident. And this is why Professor Asma was talking about 20 years later, the things that will be keeping you awake. So South Africa and many countries that are going through a transformation or that are moving from a colonial period to a period of a new democratic dispensation, there's always the danger of compromising and compromising too much. And in the process, you create institutions and laws that actually inhibit the change that you want to see. And the national water legislation has got so many provisions that I could discuss and explain in detail, whose purpose is solely to ensure that it is going to take South Africa many, many decades before the equitable sharing of water is achieved. The reference was made to existing law for water uses. And I'm also going to speak to what Dr. Schreiner made reference to in terms of customary law. So we must not forget that this legislation that we have in South Africa is not really a legislation that was created without history. This legislation codified the common law, the Roman Dutch law, that was brought to South Africa by the colonizers. And it displaced the African customary law. And the Constitution recognizes the common law, African customary law, and legislation as legal sources that are of equal validity and legitimacy. So, but what you are seeing right now, from listening to you, Inga, and these other speakers, you can see customary law struggling to validate itself. But you have the legislation that is codified the common law. And you know who was intended to benefited by that common law. And they continue to benefit because of the provisions like existing law for water uses. As late as 2 months ago, water was sold in South Africa, was traded in terms of the legislation. There are provisions in the National Water Act that allows, or that were interpreted because of their vagueness, because it was a compromise. They were interpreted as allowing holders of water entitlements to trade and sell them. I've had the misfortune of sitting over cases where land has been reclaimed through the land reform program, and the previous owners have sold the water rights or entitlements attached to that land to their buddies and colleagues in the same area And the people who are getting the new land will get land without water. And the price I'm talking about here is not a small amounts of dollars. We are talking of 5 million rands, 1 million rands, 10 million rands, people paying for water entitlements. When you go back to how those water entitlements were acquired by the people who are selling them, they were acquired for free. Maybe they paid an application fee and filled a form, just the way you do it right now when you want to apply for a water license. So that is an injustice that is continuing. And until we deal with that problem, the water licensing regime, we address the question of existing lawful water uses, the verification exercise. Those things, I think, they're the things that we must be focusing on if we want to transform the water regime. And I'm glad that the Deputy Minister is here. We need to focus on that. We need to change, because transformation is a process that changes rights and entitlements and possessions, and automatically there is resistance. And what I see is we are talking a lot about the lack of access to water. We are not talking about what is to happen in terms of dislodging those who have entrenched rights and unlocking the water that is locked up into the old regime that has been carried over through some of the provisions in the legislation. We need to unlock that water first in order for us to enable access. Without unlocking it, there's no access.
I'd like to move on. Thank you.
Thanks, Inga. Like I said, we can talk for the whole day about this. But for me, the critical aspect is to change that legislation and to make sure that it's aligned with the objectives of transforming the water sector. Thank you
so much, and I think you've hit the nail on the head, because we often, us in the water sector, the National Water Act is this beacon, untouchable almost. But you really spoke to Barbara's point about the need not to romanticize statutory law and to acknowledge some of the pitfalls. So thank you for that. I want to move over now to Mary Jean, because Mary Jean, you sit at this intersection between water and land, as it were, really looking at irrigation and smallholder farmers, and Prof's point around water allocated not being used. I think your unit, your directorate, have many cases like that in the different provinces where you see this, and we've spoken a lot about it. What are your thoughts on the current trajectory of water reform, particularly for marginalized groups like small-scale water users, small-scale farmers?
Okay, as mentioned by a lot of speakers, the implementation has been a problem. But however, our act remains a very good act. And within it, there are some intentions, consequences that we're only finding out now through the implementation, as Prof has mentioned, that has become detrimental to achieve inequality. Actually, it's what your DG said. We are, in certain instances, perpetuating inequality. The one issue is what was mentioned, the water trading. The pricing of water is another one. The higher we price the water, the more we marginalize our smallholder farmers, the very people that this government intended to assist. The licensing process, that is so cumbersome that for a small farmer, after it was 300 days, it's now 100 days, but even that 100 days is too long for for our farmers to wait for them to be able to be legally utilizing the water. Then there's the issue of the water allocation reform, and I want to look at it broadly. WRC, Desigan mentioned the fact that we need the transformational approach by combining the three systems, the customary, etc., etc. But within them, including in our Water Act, we forget to mention the access of water by women. And yet women are the ones that are in closest proximity traditionally in all over South Africa, and indeed all over Africa. And water allocation reform was the one tool by which we could let them access the water. However, we've been behind in terms of that. Then there was something mentioned by Jennifer. she's saying that often the paper water they have is not quite what is available in the system. And here's the thing, we funded research, which we co-funded with Desigan, and we found out that the paper water allocated to agriculture is actually far less than what we're using. Prof, it might be that we are not using our water that is allocated, but the reality is most of the areas that we that was in this research was fully irrigated. So it looks like there's more water allocated than that there's actually being used. But we need to do more research to determine, have we really measured the amount of water that we're using? So in terms of agriculture, our concern is the National Water Master Plan states that they've only transferred 4% of water to HDIs. And that is a concern because it's been 20 odd years now, and the very intention of the Water Act hasn't been achieved. And according to the research by the national department that deals with water, that is what they're saying in terms of how much water has been transferred already. So if imagine how much of that has gone to our smallholder farmers, basically very little, and even less to the women that use the water. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are very, very good comments as well, Mary Jean. And yeah, it's quite staggering if you think about it in those numbers, 4%, you know, of water transferred to HDIs. Barbara van Koppen, you've also been working in this space, not only in South Africa, but also within the region globally. So I'd like to give you a brief opportunity, if you can also just to talk a little bit about how can a harmonization of customary law with global best practice and statutory law actually work, and how can this best be achieved? Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks, Inga. Thanks, Deputy Minister. Thanks, speakers. Very exciting topic for weeks, if not months. Let me just pick out one thing internationally to answer some of the issues raised. And that's Kenya. Kenya, say some of the engineers there say, we implement the South African Water Act. So we reproduced and now we implement the South African Water Act, also showing the importance of the National Water Act. Kenya is interesting because in 1929, the European permit systems were introduced in Kenya, so a bit on the decolonization. The few settlers came, declared all water resources in Kenya to be vested in His Majesty the King of England, and then they explicitly only allowed and imposed permits for the white settlers, for a minority. Permits work for a minority, and they hived off all the water pertinent to land. So they disconnected already in 1929 the land rights and water rights to give more power over water in the end. And at that time, they said, we will inform Africans when we are going to take water away. So that is the legacy of the licensing systems that has never been really unpacked, not even in the 1990s when the integrated water resource management, very much a northern dialogue and a northern discourse, said, oh, permits, licenses are the best tool in the world, so let us, the whole world should now either revitalize their permit systems, the colonial ones, or they should newly introduce, as South Africa has been doing. So we are dealing with a tough legacy. That's why it takes time. The Kenyans, they don't have the level of water scarcity as South Africa as yet. So also for the future, we all look at South Africa. They immediately realize it can't be implemented. We can't license or millions of small-scale users, billions of small-scale farmers in Kenya. And they started also thinking about what are the tools in the law that can help us? And in Kenya, they take 4 different categories, very small ones, very decentralized, just registering. B, a bit bigger, C, D, and the D ones, really the big users, the high impact users, they should get proportionate efforts to set conditions, no overuse, payment, no waste discharge, due process, etc. You first have to see whether you're going to affect water users when you want to newly plan, etc. So they also differentiated in categories. And in that sense, now turning to South Africa, I agree with everybody, the tools are there. The general authorization, at the moment, it's even less than a Schedule 1 use in practice, as it is usually interpreted. In stress basin, this 0.2 hectare, if you have 0.25 hectare, you need a license. And that's exactly the point that you raised, Regine. It's impossible for both the states and the small-scale users. And it doesn't recognize any customary law at all. The good news is also that there are a lot of investments being done by farmer-led irrigation development, as Mark alluded to, and you as well, supported seller supply. People, they invest in infrastructure themselves, otherwise they die if they don't get water for domestic users. And also for irrigation. Anyhow, when communities invest in infrastructure, it's always multiple use. Communities are the only place where there is really integrated water resource management. For example,
so you would say the general authorization is one of those legal tools that we need to look at?
Absolutely, but a higher threshold, and I think I already mentioned the priority. Briscoe Rasmal, thanks for remembering him, he would immediately say, of course, small-scale productive uses are a human need as well. It's a matter of interpreting what is a basic human need. And yeah, that's another discussion that I'm sure we will have as well. And then it is a priority, it can be in the reserve. And then lastly, the question is who has to bear the burden of managing the ecological reserve as well? Should the people who don't have any water in the first place, should they now be punished to implement an ecological reserve? They haven't contributed to the problem of ecological and the need for an ecological reserve. So I would personally say basic human needs for domestic and productive uses have a higher priority than the ecological reserve.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much for that. We're running out of time, and I do want to ask patients if it's possible to just summarize quickly some comments or feedback from the floor, so that we can maybe go around the room for discussants to respond in sort of 20 seconds each. That's what we're
okay.
Very short, but patients, what's been coming out of the chat?
Okay, you can hear me, Inga, I hope?
Yes.
Okay, so out of Prof. Tumai's presentation, when he was talking about how customary rights are struggling to validate themselves, there were some interesting comments coming from Temba, who's also talking about how the process should be simplified for small-scale users who are finding it hard to understand the process of applying for water use rights, and also women who sometimes don't even know that there is a process of applying for these water uses. We also have a comment coming from Ashwin, highlighting shortcomings in implementing water trading rights. This is still happening. Water trading is still happening, even though there was a moratorium that was put on it. So sort of also commenting to Prof. Tumai's presentation that there has been a moratorium put on the trading of water rights to, at least protect some of this water for marginalized users. So yeah, some of the threats coming out, protection of rights for other marginalized groups like traditional healers and small-scale water users should come out quite strongly.
Thank you very much for that, Patience. I want to give the discussants now an opportunity just to say a few final words. Like I said, a few seconds each, last parting words. Who should we start with? Barbara Schreiner, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks, Inga, and I'll try and be very brief. I think it's been an extremely interesting discussion. I think for me, the point is that actually The tools are there. We know what needs to be done. It's a question of actually doing it. We could be using what is there within the National Water Act, within customary law, what's in the National Water Resources Strategy. The question is, does the will exist to really do it? And some of it is actually not major rocket science. We don't need to sit around and talk about it until we get paralysis by analysis. We actually need to put it in place and do it. And I think I want to end by saying the perfect is the enemy of the good. If we try and, there are flaws in any system, but we actually need to put it in place to do it and to learn by doing, rather than trying to find a system that we think is going to be perfect. We need to get something that works better on the ground and actually deliver on it.
Thanks so much, Barbara. Mary Jean, final words from your side, please.
Like Barbara says, the tools are there, but we're not communicating, or we're not listening, or one or the other. And how to do it is maybe if we could have these conversations with each other more than what we've been previously doing before, of working in silos. So more communication, and maybe by then we should also get newer ideas from your international experiences out there. So we'd be very glad as government to hear what the international experiences are, and that we should be talking more to each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Prof, Tumai, from your side, parting words. You're still on mute, Prof.
Thank you. I wish there was always more time. For me, my preoccupation was making law that works in context. And until we do that, otherwise we have to really make polycentric political decisions. So for example, I've heard about general authorizations, compulsory licensing. It might be time for the government to actually use those tools, regardless of the consequences. Because there is resistance, and there's going to be resistance. So for me, we really need to implement right now. Otherwise, we are going to be spending more sleepless nights dealing with the issues coming out of those who are excluded from accessing water resources.
Great stuff. Thank you. Thanks for that, Prof. Really good. And Barbara van Koppen, last words from your side, please.
And quick, and then listening to the Deputy Minister. And bottom-up empowerment, in which the human need for water aligns with the Constitution that says people have a right to water and to food. So small-scale productive uses that help to get basic income should be in the reserve.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the discussants. This was really way too little time, but really rich discussion. I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague at the Water Research Commission, John Dini, the research manager for this portfolio, just to say a few concluding remarks and to close us off. So John, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Inga, and hello everyone, panelists, Deputy Minister, colleagues. I am mindful that we're over time, so I'm going to keep it very, very brief. But just to pick up on one or two things that came out, I think I fully agree with Prof. Murombo that we could easily spend a week on this subject and to do it justice. And perhaps what we're seeing here is it's the start of a conversation, although probably calling it the start is not correct, because we know this conversation's been going on. But as the issues become into clearer and clearer focus, and the urgency just grows, maybe what's required is a steepening of the curve of this conversation. To borrow a turn of phrase from something else that's been on our minds a lot lately. So I think we need to be having more conversations of this type as time goes on, and certainly as the WRC, I'm going to take the advantage of having the floor to commit by Boss Desigan and the WRC to supporting more of this type of conversation, because I think in South Africa now we have a fantastic window of opportunity that's open, and the Deputy Minister touched on this in his input. Our Water Act is now 22 years old, And for the first time since it came into effect in 1998, it's about to undergo a major revision. So there's a window of opportunity that's open there for us to start feeding in all of these ideas into that process, because we know, I think we're starting to accept, those of us, and I include myself among them, who wore the rosy tinted glasses around the beauty of the National Water Act, are starting to accept that there are some serious problems that we have to confront. And we now have an opportunity to do just that. So I'm certainly hoping that the work of the project that Inga touched on, the project that is being carried out by IWMI and funded by the WRC, has been designed to feed precisely that knowledge in. I think the big challenge, the edge for us currently in South Africa, is how do we turn those concepts, the recognition of the value of customary water resource management mechanisms, the differentiated approach to authorization, how do we actually translate that into something practical, something implementable, something legislatable, if that's a word? Because I feel like that's the edge that we're at now in terms of the knowledge base, and we have the window of opportunity opening as well. So I hope that this conversation continues. Certainly from the WRC side, we will continue to engage to support the revision of the Act, feeding through any relevant knowledge, because we know that it might be many years before we get another window of opportunity like this. So with that, Inga, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. And that's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much to the speakers, to the discussants for this really rich session and inputs. I might take Prof. Marumba up on his suggestion for a week-long symposium. I think we do need to delve a lot deeper into these issues. There's so much more to talk through and to implement. So once again, thank you. If all the speakers and discussants can please enable their cameras so that we can just all recognize them. And thank you again to everybody for listening in. Speakers, just stay for a second. I just want to take a group photo, if that's okay. Jennifer, if you can enable your camera, that would be great. Then we have everybody. But thank you, everybody. And then that's a wrap. So.
Thank you, Inga, for the sharing.
Thank you very much
Thanks,
for running
everyone.